For most Germans, Adolf Hitler was by turn their savior and their nemesis. In just 12 years, from 1933 to 1945, the German people played out a tragedy. They went from being Europe's pariahs to masters of the continent and back again. During his time in power, Adolf Hitler enjoyed huge popular support. Even today, some Germans maintain that life in the Third Reich had much going for it. But with the benefit of hindsight, the rational mind can only wonder how a civilized nation could ever have made a pact with someone so obviously evil. The 1930s for most Germans were not years of terror, murder and repression. Their lives were dominated by order, calm, full employment and prosperity. A 1949 survey of public opinion summarized its findings. The Nazis provided a guaranteed pay packet, order, strength through joy, and the smooth running of the political machinery. National Socialism made people think less of personal freedom and more of the opportunity to work, adequate nourishment, and the absence of disarray in political life. As late as 1951, 6 years after the end of the war, almost half of the people questioned in the Federal Republic described the years from 1933 to 1939 as the best of times for Germany. For ordinary Germans, the Nazis brought a period of calm after the turbulence of the 1920s. Life for them in that decade had been intolerable. Work was scarce and factory workers were frequently laid off owing to a lack of orders. There was no social security benefit and people were reduced to scavenging to feed their families. The spectre of unemployment haunted a generation. One of Hitler's election promises was that of full employment. He fulfilled that pledge. From the moment that he took office, he embarked on a massive series of public works projects financed by business and the Treasury. The most famous and enduring monument of National Socialism is the Autobahn. Although the national motorway system had actually been started by the Weimar government, it was Hitler and the Nazis who benefited from a network which was the envy of the civilized world in the 1930s. The motorways were exploited for maximum propaganda effect, both at home and abroad. Official pictures showed thousands of eager workers building the Führer's roads. This had considerable impact, suggesting a united community in which class and privilege had been sacrificed to the common good. Between 1933 and 1938, over 3,000 kilometers of motorway were laid down. Fritz Todt, whom Hitler chose as his chief engineer, and who would carry through many of the Führer's most grandiose schemes, was also responsible for building the West Wall. This massive defensive barrier, which stretched the length of Germany's borders with France, was constructed in 1937 and 1938. At a time of growing international tension. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers and conscripted laborers were used in its completion. The West Wall had a sinister purpose. Hitler wanted to protect his western frontier as he embarked on his empire building in the east. The defenses would buy Hitler time to meet any threat posed by the British or the French if they lost patience with his aggressive expansionist policies. Fortunately for the Germans, the effectiveness of the defenses was never put to the test. Even after the outbreak of war, the French appeasers were content to remain behind their own massive defensive barrier, the Maginot Line. The public works schemes stimulated the economy. They provided jobs and revitalized moribund German industries. The new highways in particular gave a sense of equal opportunity among the workforce. The defensive line and the motorway system were designed to play their part in the coming war. But the millions of workers involved in these and similar projects were not by and large troubled by the design behind them. All they knew was that they had regained the self-respect which had been denied them by unemployment. The German nation was largely apolitical as a result of centuries of autocratic government and the experience of recent deprivation. As one worker put it, you had no time for political activity when you were on three-shift working. You didn't have the time or the will to make or even listen to speeches. You got up in the morning when you had to, and you didn't overstretch your break periods. I was just glad to be working. I didn't have anything to do with the Nazis. The period from 1933 to the early years of the war was generally quiet. The core of this peaceful phase was long-term economic prosperity. For many Germans, everyday life was marked not only by an economic upswing, but also by the Nazi Party's Kraft durch Freude scheme, strength through joy. Strength Through Joy was a state-sponsored program to allow ordinary Germans to take a real holiday, many for the first time. Workers went to the Baltic coast, to the Black Forest, and even abroad as part of the first mass-market tourist organization. These breaks gave Germans a leisure interest previously denied not only to them, but to the working class throughout Europe. Again, Hitler and the Nazis were not the inventors. The package holiday concept was originally established in imitation of an Italian fascist organization run along similar lines. Not surprisingly, workers welcomed these trips, which also brought large profits to rural hotel owners, as well as to the Reichsbahn, the state railway system. The Kraft durch Freude, or KDF program, also subsidized theater performances, concerts, exhibitions, sporting events, hiking, folk dancing, and adult education courses. The Nazis pumped money into it as a means of gaining mass support. The KDF received 24 million marks in 1933 and 1934, 17 million in 1935, and 15 million in 1936. In the process, under the control of its influential and debauched leader Robert Ley, it became a national business itself. Within 2 years of gaining power, the Nazis had created a holiday organization so large that 2 ocean liners with 1-class accommodation were built specially for it. Even the famous Volkswagen, or people's car, was originally named the KDF wagon. Before its introduction, cars had been symbols of bourgeois status, but now, as with the Model T Ford in America, a family car was within reach of the ordinary German family. Ferdinand Porsche, the car's designer, made a present of one of the first Volkswagens to Hitler on his 49th birthday. However, the Führer was the only person to get a production model. Although 100,000 Volkswagens were ordered, not one family ever took delivery. When war broke out, production of the car was halted, and its chassis was used as the basis of a military jeep-like vehicle, the Kübelwagen. The KDF was regarded by the Nazi elite as practical proof of the benefits of National Socialism. Robert Ley summarized its goals. The worker sees that we are serious about raising his social position. He sees that it is not the so-called educated classes whom we show to the world. In the years to come, the worker will lose the last traces of inferiority feelings he may have inherited from the past. But the real, if unstated aim of Kraft durch Freude was to spur German workers to greater productivity. The KDF was a massive bribe to the workforce, and the so-called revolutionary movement was actually designed to make bosses' lives easier. The German workers did not find themselves with much more leisure time under the Third Reich, and even when they did venture out of the home and away from the radio set, they found a bland diet at the local cinema and at the music hall. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels was good at playing to the lowest common denominator. He knew what the people wanted, and he made sure that they got it. Popular entertainers, especially during the war, were kept busy. The middle classes were not ignored. There were operas and classical concerts aplenty. However, any really innovative art was crushed, since such activity was invariably a departure from what was officially approved. The view of the Nazi hierarchy is best expressed by Goering's famous quote, "When I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun." Most Germans took their newfound prosperity at face value. The Nazis were seen as a force for stability. Everything seemed to be in order again after the chaos of the 1920s. People were not ignorant of the newly established concentration camps, but they were accepted as being necessary to restore order and German prestige. The camps touched the lives of comparatively few citizens, and the truth of their brutality was not common knowledge. Even those who knew former inmates did not know the whole story. Released prisoners were forced to sign a piece of paper saying they would never talk about their experiences inside the camps on pain of immediate rearrest. The effects of Nazi rule were also felt in the countryside. The traditional rural voter had been quick to embrace Hitler's conservative message of law and order. But Nazi belief in blood and soil actually upset rather than enhanced life in the countryside. Some Nazis, like Himmler, had a curious mystical attachment to the timeless values of rural Germany. Himmler was expressing a strong anti-industrialist yearning in German society. But the Reichsführer SS took it to extremes, seeing imaginary virtues in the honest toil of the laboring peasant. The Nazi message of change appealed mainly to the young. The appeal to youth led to problems between the generations as new Nazi structures replaced the old village life based around the family. Young men and women who had joined Nazi youth organizations carried their new confidence into the home and challenged traditional notions of parental control. For many villagers, this resulted in many wars within the household, as loyalty to the Nazi state clashed with the more traditional set of structures of the older generation. Under the Third Reich, the family in the countryside lost much of its role in the training and rearing of children. Distorted teaching in school, coupled with indoctrination by the Hitler youth, imparted to rural children a very different view of life than the one traditionally held by their parents. Time that youngsters would in the past have spent helping in the fields were now taken up with activity and paramilitary exercises associated with Nazi youth organizations. When they reached 18, young men and women were recruited into labor and military units, and this compounded the distance between the children of the village and their parents. At harvest time, it was no longer the sons and daughters of the villages who carried out the work. The thousands of youths from the cities who had been sent into the countryside to get clean air and improve their physical fitness. Once war broke out in 1939, men were drafted for frontline service, and the villagers were forced to accept evacuees from the Allied bombing of German cities. In villages across Germany, mayors were tasked with assessing each home in the village to see how much space could be made available for displaced Germans. As the war went against Germany on the Eastern Front, large numbers of German refugees moved west to escape the Red Army. These people all needed to be housed. These newcomers were accepted with passive resignation and silent anger. Hitler was attracted to and respected women who were completely conventional. His ideal type was a cute, cuddly, naive little thing, tender and sweet. Their primary responsibility was, he said, reproduction. His attitude found its fullest expression in Nazi policies towards women in the Third Reich. Gertrude Schultz-Klink, who led the Nazi women's movement, helped set back female emancipation by decades. She proclaimed, "The German woman is knitting again." The goal for women in Nazi Germany was the care of man, soul, body, and mind. Her mission in marriage was as comrade and helper, to be the perfect consort to her husband. The Nazis were never publicly going to state their real view of women, that they were breeding factories for the cannon fodder necessary for Hitler to realize his foreign policy ambitions. Instead, they created an ideal type for every woman to aspire to. Nazi art portrayed women within the traditional environment of the family, where mother, father, and child had their allotted roles. The Nazis were also anxious to increase the declining birth rate in Germany. Women were denied access to abortion and other types of birth control. They were also offered financial incentives to bear children. Those who did not conform to the racially pure stereotype or who had genetic diseases were to be housed in institutions and forcibly sterilized. The film Erbkrank, produced by the propaganda ministry, helped to reinforce the message. Goebbels' production depicted the handicapped as degenerates, useless eaters, a drain upon the state, whose bloodline had to cease immediately and so cleanse the gene pool. Germans with large families were particularly exalted. Hitler's mother's birthday was reserved as a day for mothers, and the most fertile received special awards. There was an honor cross in 3 classes, with the gold award being reserved for mothers of 8 or more. Any trend toward the emancipation of women was strictly dealt with. Women were not meant to concern themselves with outward appearance. Cosmetics and depilation were considered unnatural. The fresh, healthy beauty of the Aryan woman was constantly being compared favorably to the heavily made-up women of more decadent cultures. One area in which National Socialist notions of a woman's place had only limited success was in the workplace. The Nazis actively discriminated against women entering the professions. Such an attitude found favor among the existing ranks of these traditionally male elites. Women were also barred from jury service, as Hitler thought that they could not think logically or reason objectively. Everything about Nazism stressed male superiority. Males thought for the nation and safeguarded its values. The father was king in the household, ruling by divine right, and the rest of the family had to accept his absolute primacy. Many women accepted their lot, playing out the role allotted them in the unremitting sloganeering of the propaganda ministry. They voted for Hitler in the elections of 1932, and contemporary newsreels are full of images of women in near ecstasy when addressed by their Führer, or when given the opportunity to touch him. Sometimes Nazi rhetoric had to bend to reality. The Nazis had planned to take 800,000 women out of the workforce in the 4 years from 1933. But the demands on industry, posed by rearmament and the growing shortage of males in the labor force, meant that even more women were called upon to maintain industrial production. By the end of 1938, German labor exchanges reported 1 million vacancies, and the existing male labor force was using its much stronger bargaining position to its advantage in wage negotiations. Reluctantly, the state fell back upon the female labor pool. Women without children and older women were an obvious source of labor to meet the shortfall. They were given incentives to return to work. Factories were fitted out with better medical facilities, and some even with creches. But even while they used them, the Nazis still propagated an attitude of protective superiority towards women. Nevertheless, by 1939, the number of women in paid employment had increased substantially. War brought even greater strain on manpower, and women were encouraged to come forward and take the place of the men that had left for the front. Women were now taking on every kind of role. They worked at the lathe and the sewing machine, in hospitals, at home and at the front, in the soup kitchens and on public transport. They coordinated collections of materials for fighting soldiers and even served in anti-aircraft batteries. Even so, women were not used to the full. In Britain and America, rearmament resulted in a massive explosion in the numbers of women workers. But Nazi reluctance to employ women contributed to Germany's defeat. Indeed, the proportion of women employed in the arms industry was lower than it had been in the First World War. Although German propaganda made much of the family, the Nazis actually did their best to undermine the institution because it was the biggest challenge to state control. The younger section of the population proved very receptive to the benefits offered by a policy of rearmament, as well as to the ideas of a Führer state that promised to restore Germany's greatness. German youth was being offered a great part to play in this mission. Young people who became teenagers from the mid-30s had few memories of the pre-Hitler days, and one tragic generation was to go through a schooling process steeped in National Socialism. It was through the Hitler Youth that young people learned about Nazism. Many of those press-ganged into membership did not understand the principles or doctrine, but that hardly mattered. They were programmed instead to obey orders and to stop thinking when the magic words of Führer and Fatherland were uttered. By the close of 1933, virtually all of the youth movements in Germany had been subsumed into the growing bureaucracy of the Hitler Jugend. By 1934, it contained 47% of all German boys between 10 and 14, and 38% of all boys between 14 and 18, the Hitler Youth proper. The figures for girls were not as high, but were still impressive. 15% of 10-year-olds joined the Jungmädel, while 8% of the 14 to 18 age group were in the Bund Deutscher Mädel. Hitler had put his faith in the young. He needed to produce a nation of warriors who were prepared to die for him without question. He wanted a violently active, dominating youth. It must be indifferent to pain, and I will have no intellectual training. Knowledge is ruin to my young men. 3 years after the Nazi accession to power, university admissions had dropped by 53%. Boys believed that a life in the service of the Führer was going to be more interesting than anything they could learn from books. The young were deeply impressed to be told that they were vital to the future of Germany. The Hitler Youth, under the Führer's ambitious disciple Baldur von Schirach, became a highly efficient factory whose end product was a violent, dedicated killing machine. At 10, a boy was compelled to register with Reich Youth Headquarters. At 14, he entered the Hitler Youth, and at 18, he joined the party. After a year of work experience with the State Labor Service, he was ready to join the armed forces. It was impossible for the young to understand the implications of what was going on. The boys loved the marching, the songs, the games, and the great sense of camaraderie. Classmates of H.J. boys were eager to be a part of the same team. To be included was everything. To be outside the movement was to be nothing. The boys proved themselves in constant competition. All sports were taught with this struggle in mind. Winning was the only prize worth having. With the outbreak of war, German youth was kept busy on a whole raft of projects designed to account for every free hour. They assisted in collecting money and materials for armaments and in sorting blankets and clothes for the troops. They helped in firefighting and in clearing up after raids, a job in which they were exposed to the most appalling of sights. They had to grow up quickly. Eventually, even the youngest members were called up to fill the ranks in Germany's decimated divisions. The girls were also regimented and kept very busy. Like the boys, they took part in pan-European gymnastic competitions, which were made much of by the newsreels to illustrate the supremacy of the Teuton. At the same time, they were expected to bear more of the domestic burden, as mothers increasingly went out to work. They were also used on morale-raising exercises, meeting veterans on their return from the front. At 17, after leaving the BDM, they could join Glaube und Schönheit, an organization where they received training in how to become a domestic goddess. Faith and beauty was tailored to give spiritual and physical grace to young women between the ages of 17 and 21. Their graduates were portrayed as the perfect specimens of womanhood, just as the men of the SS were the paragons of Aryan masculinity. Heinrich Himmler was closely involved with the development of the HJ. His fanciful mystic notions of blood and soil found expression in the Landjahr, where boys and girls of the movement were sent into the countryside to learn about every aspect of farming. To the alarm of many parents, however, this back-to-basics course led to a huge increase in teenage pregnancies. Domestic life in Hitler's Germany was tolerable, even positive, in the 1930s. Unless, of course, you were a Jew, a communist, or one of various groups classed as undesirable. But war changed much of this. Initially, public opinion had little enthusiasm for the war. The people were delighted, however, by the rapid and relatively painless successes that Hitler brought them. While the German army seemed unbeatable, the regime's popularity remained high. One woman recalled her family's reaction to the fall of France. After the great victory in France, the atmosphere was unbelievable in Germany. Everyone was delirious with joy. I and my father got quite drunk when the end of the fighting was announced. It seemed impossible to believe that France had collapsed and England was beaten back across the Channel. I know we were terribly relieved when our men came home safely. My husband Ludwig had been in some fighting, but had not, he claimed, been in any great danger. He was, of course, delighted to be back with his wife and daughter, and we had a good time celebrating. These were the good times. The Germans were masters of Europe and enjoyed their supremacy. But the war dragged on, and concern began to grow. Even though the Wehrmacht had failed to defeat Britain, Hitler went ahead with the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. A security service report from Stuttgart, dated the 29th of July 1941, noted a mood of disgruntlement. In domestic politics, the mood and bearing of the population is still depressed, worried, full of mistrust, annoyance and frustration, although the food situation has improved a little. Another report from Leipzig on the 6th of August of that year betrayed a more fundamental worry. The events in the East are causing people a great deal of concern. Whilst nobody doubts that the Soviets will be defeated, they had not reckoned with such a tough opponent. People are anticipating heavy losses, including on our side, and expecting the exhaustion of our reserves of human material, which for months will make it impossible to achieve our real war aim of finishing off England. There is also concern about a new wartime winter involving very hard work with minimum food. This report illustrates two of the most important concerns of the German civilian population in World War II: the losses of their loved ones as the fighting became more costly, and the imposition of rationing. One typical housewife commented on the availability of food. When the war started, everyone was issued with ration cards. At first everything seemed well organized. There were no shortages. We heard tales from the Allied side that Germany was in all sorts of difficulties as a result of the English and French blockade. I know our papers under Dr. Goebbels used to make fun of such things. It is a fact that no real shortages occurred for some time, though there were people who missed luxuries such as we never had. The basic foodstuffs were never in short supply until about 1943. The combination of shortages and also a sense that there was some unfairness in the distribution of commodities, with the rich and those with connections being favored, created a climate conducive to illicit trading and the black market. One Nazi district leader noted that the population demanded absolute fairness above all, and resented the fact that, for example, horse meat was rationed, whereas poultry was not, and could be had at exorbitant prices. A civilian working for the Luftwaffe recalled that the authorities did their best to prevent such activities. Things became very scarce as the quantity and quality of supplies became worse. All we seemed to get was potatoes, bread, sausage and cabbage. We did not do too well. But even given this dissatisfaction with the basic necessities of life, people were not concerned with political opposition to the regime. They were too busy getting on with the day-to-day business of living. Besides, criticizing the party could be dangerous. According to rumor, the Gestapo had informers everywhere. You could not trust your neighbor, let alone the person next to you on the bus. One word out of place could lead you to prison or worse. And despite the hardships, people sought diversions to keep up their morale. One correspondent explained, "Our life is not completely materialistic. Never before have I listened to such beautiful music as during this Fifth War winter. We treated ourselves to season tickets for various music cycles and trudged through rain and snow to the 4 p.m. concerts at the Music Halle. Many theaters closed during the war, but Goebbels was keen to fill those that remained open with light entertainment so that the people did not have time to think for themselves. And whatever the quality or type of production, there was not a seat to be had in the house. Housewives and returning veterans, the retired and the young, escaped for an hour or two from their daily deprivations to laugh together. Entertainment was also a welcome diversion from the intense efforts demanded by Albert Speer, who exhorted the factory workers to make ever greater efforts for the fatherland. Retired laborers and technicians were recalled to the factories and taught new skills. The factories were open around the clock. There were frequent award ceremonies, either to individual workers who had upped their productivity or to plant managers for outstanding contributions to the war industry. War heroes and party stalwarts were always on hand at the presentations. To the humble worker, the prospect of being presented with an award by one of the Nazi great and good was an extra incentive to perform. Allied air raids became a major part of the urban Germans' existence, particularly after the British improved their bombing techniques from late 1942 onwards. Although women and children were evacuated to smaller towns and into the countryside, many civilians chose to remain in the cities and take their chances in the air raid shelters. Offices, homes and hospitals emptied as civilians answered the call of the sirens, leaving the streets deserted. For a moment, silence reigned, before the thudding of the German flag started up and bombs started to fall. After the night terrors, daily life resumed afresh. Repairs were made to communications, craters were filled in with rubble, the dead were dug out from the debris. Food was distributed to the bombed out to keep morale high. The Germans were prepared to face most perils with a full stomach. But the stoic acceptance of suffering by the German people was not acknowledged by their supreme leader. Albert Speer gives a telling insight into the Führer's mind regarding Allied raids. When informed of one particularly heavy raid, he recalled, "Hitler was obviously shaken by these reports, although less by the casualties among the populace or the bombing of residential areas than by the destruction of valuable buildings, especially theaters. Consequently, he was likely to demand that burned-out theaters be rebuilt immediately." Hitler had no interest in visiting bombed towns and cities to raise morale. Speer said, "I tried a few times to persuade Hitler to travel to the bombed cities and let himself be seen there. Goebbels too had tried to put over the same idea, but in vain." Indeed, such was the Führer's lack of interest in seeing bomb damage, that when being driven through Munich or Berlin, he ordered his chauffeur to take the shortest route. Shattered German cities did not sit comfortably with his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. But although Hitler disappeared from the public view, that same public never lost faith in him. Many actually believed that he had brought the Germans this far and that he couldn't desert them now. They believed in his promises of final victory. They daubed Goebbels' catchphrases on the walls, or if the walls were not standing, on placards amid the ruins. The Germans continued to fight and die in their millions. Incredibly, there was no mass revolt. As the Soviets approached from the east and the Allies crossed the hallowed Rhine, they fought ever harder, old as well as young, fighting side by side at the barricades. In the end, Hitler's prophecy of a Volksgemeinschaft, a community of the people, had been realized, but only in death. The end came suddenly when Hitler committed suicide. His Third Reich had been utterly defeated, and now the German people had to submit to the victors for the second time in a generation. The Allies wanted to make the Germans realize that they'd been living under a monster, not a god. They forced ordinary citizens to visit the sites of the liberated concentration camps. They did not have to travel far. There were camps on the doorsteps of most major German towns. The people were forced to view the piles of corpses, to inter them, and to exhume others for proper burial. Now that the ceaseless voice of Goebbels' propaganda ministry had been silenced, Germany came face to face with the gross excesses of Nazi policy. Some chose not to accept the truth and would continue to believe that Hitler had been good for Germany. Others wept at the horror and sense of betrayal.